In all the years I've been building terrain, one thing I've never really built or finished building is a full rocky forest table. It's something I've wanted to do for ages, and I'm super glad that I've managed to get that project done. G'day everyone, Viv here. I hope you're all keeping well. Welcome back. To crack on with this project, I needed to fish out some pieces that I made about a year ago. I knew I was going to need a couple of extra pieces. I only built 3 or 4 or 5 pieces. So I played around with the layout and figured out how many extra pieces I'd need, and then began the process of using some Woodland Scenics rock molds to cast up some more bits and pieces to use. This is a really enjoyable process. I love casting, whether it's, resin or metal or plaster. It's just, there's something therapeutic about pouring in, the material, whether it's resin or metal or plaster, into a mold, waiting for it to set and then popping out the pieces. So I put them on one of my favorite shows and then just spent the evening casting loads and loads and loads of rock molds. I probably ran each of these molds maybe 7 or 8 times over the course of, a few hours. Either have Stargate on in the background or Lord of the Rings or, one of your favorite shows. Pop those on and then just start casting pieces. These need to dry properly before you can use them, so I go ahead and pop them in the oven at a very low temperature for a few hours just to help that liquid inside there, evaporate or dehydrate a little bit faster. Once everything is properly dried out, I can start playing around with the various different pieces and figure out, what's going to work well on the type and size of bases that I've got. And once I figure that out, it's simply a matter of hot gluing all of those rock molds down onto the MDF to get ready for the next step. Some of my pieces had already been built up, the ones that I built previously. So to replicate that, I took some packaging foam. This is expanded polystyrene, the white beady stuff. It's not ideal for terrain making. You'd rather use extruded polystyrene, but for this purpose where I'm going to be covering all of this in very hard plaster later on, it's going to work perfectly fine. So I cut a couple of blocks to the size and shape that I'm going to need to build up my land mass, and then glue those down to my MDF boards with a little bit of hot glue, and then go through quickly with a knife and just give a very general overview of the shape that I need, keeping in mind that this is all going to be covered in those rock casts a little bit later on. This is where things start to get really messy, and I love getting messy when I'm making terrain. I'm using some homemade sculptor mold, or a modeling compound. It's basically paper pulp and plaster with a little bit of water, or quite a lot of water mixed into it, and I'm spreading that over the entire base. For these rocks that are flat, it's pretty easy. I'm just filling in all the gaps and covering the rest of the base so that there's some undulation, so I'm just don't have a flat base. For the larger, the rock mounds, the cliff faces, I try a couple of different things. First, I try one where I cover the whole block of foam with some of that material, and then I start picking and choosing different sorts of rocks and pushing them in and then gluing them in with some PVA, and it works. But then I decide, I might try a different approach. So I take some rock pieces and I glue them onto the foam with some hot glue, and I fill in around the base. And as I'm doing this, I'm really enjoying this one way more. It's a lot easier. I can see the rock formations much better. And then I take some filler and fill in the gaps with a paintbrush. It's a different method. It's working. I'm enjoying the process, and I think next time I might try this again. Once I've finished doing this, I go through with that sculptor mold and cover the rest of the base so I have that undulated effect. Now that I've got all my pieces done, I can play around with the layout again, make sure that I've got enough coverage, and start the process of painting. Now, this was the biggest drama because I already had those existing pieces. There's 4 or 5 pieces that I started with. I wanted to try and match the color of the rock formations as best as I could. Now, I didn't keep any notes. I don't remember what colors I used to paint the original ones. So I'm kind of flying a little bit blind here. Now, with these plaster casts, there are some wonderful techniques that you can use to really help bring out the detail in those casts. And being plaster, they absorb paint and inks and washes very, very well. But I knew that I didn't paint the original ones like that. I did a basic, paint them black, paint them grey, dry brush them grey. And so I thought I'd go with that approach and see where I could get to. In the end, it didn't really work out. I must have used a bunch of different sorts of colors on the original ones, including some tan colors in there, because by the time I get to the end of painting these new pieces, they look similar, but you can see if you look close enough that some of that depth is missing. Some of that variation and, in the color palette just isn't there, specifically the creamy tones. There's a tan color. I must have wet blended a bunch of the colors when I was doing the originals. I don't know. I didn't keep notes. I never keep notes. Mental note to myself, keep notes. But I go through and I paint them. I fish out different sorts of colors. And at the end of the day, it has kind of all come together. To base all these new pieces, I kind of needed to follow the same process that I did with the originals. Now, I'm fairly certain that I used dirt on the base. That's just, regular dirt from my garden, which I dried out in the oven. And I put down a neat layer of PVA, sprinkled on the dirt, and then I would have applied a couple of different sorts of flocks to it. Now, I don't remember exactly which colors I used. I would have made my own flocks. I did a tutorial many a decade ago on my old Rubbish In Rubbish Out channel on how to make, sawdust flock. And so I would have used a couple of different colors to help blend that into the dirt. I probably would have sprayed down some isopropyl alcohol, then put some flock on, then added some sealant on top of that. I couldn't really remember how I did the original, so I just sort of winged it. And, I think it's come up okay. Landscaping is one of the most enjoyable parts of building these sorts of natural terrain layouts. This is where things really start to come to life. It's kind of like building, an urban table or a sci-fi table or a post-apocalyptic table, where all those little details that you add to the table just, each detail makes it pop just a little bit more. And here, by adding all of these bushes, I'm using different sorts of clump foliage. This is probably old woodland scenic stuff that I had milling around from different projects. It's all gone into one tub, so it's a blend of all different sorts of colors. Adding this on a load of different sorts of grass tufts, wherever you feel is needed on the piece. I put PVA neat onto the piece sometimes and push stuff onto it. I've also got a little palette off to the side there where I keep some PVA where I dip stuff into and then put it onto the terrain. It doesn't really matter. As long as you've got a little bit of glue to help it adhere, you'll be fine. You can't really go wrong with this step. It is probably one of the most enjoyable parts of building natural based terrain is, slowly seeing it come to life. The last step in the process is to add some trees. Now, there's so many different ways to make trees. You can make your own, you can buy them. I'll leave a link in the description to the trees that I've used on this table. They're not amazing, but they were cheap and they work well. Now, I wanted my trees to be removable, so I simply just drilled all the way through with maybe a 1.5 mil drill bit. I can't quite remember. Something big enough that the base of these trees would just be able to easily slide into. That way, when I needed to store them, I could take the trees off and pop them away. This last step here really made the pieces come to life. Now, I don't mind that, you can see that little hole there when the trees aren't in there. That's fine. Maybe I'll make something to plug that later on. But all up, the whole table has come together, perfectly. It was a super fun project. I'm really glad to have got it complete. I'm looking forward to adding some extra pieces to this in the future. Maybe a little shack, maybe a little campsite with a fireplace or something like that. Maybe, just helping to add those signs of life. So there we go. It was a great project. Thanks so much for tuning in once again. If you've got any questions or comments, please leave them in the description below. And if you haven't subscribed already, please click that red subscribe button and hit the bell notification to make sure that you don't miss anything in the future. Thanks for tuning in. I will see you next time. Bye.